Hi everybody. Thanks so much for joining in. If you're watching live, thanks for staying up late or getting up early depending on your time zone. And if you're watching the recording, thank you as well. Tonight I'm going to take you from Mockup to Genesis from the standpoint of working with a developer. Now you may be sitting at your computer thinking, there is no way I'm letting someone else touch my projects. I can totally appreciate that, and as I'll explain shortly, it hasn't been very long since I thought that way myself. By the end of this session, I hope to provide you with some reasons why you might outsource development, as well as solid tips for workflow when partnering with a developer. Just to give you a little background, I've been building websites since the mid-90s. I built static HTML sites for a lot of years before I switched to WordPress in 2009. And it was a difficult transition to say the least. I was actually a little bit snobby toward people who built on a CMS like WordPress because I felt like they were cheating or they weren't real designers or developers. I don't know, I had an attitude problem. Once I switched to WordPress though, I realized how much I had been suffering because I was doing all that heavy lifting myself. Spoiler alert, that stubbornness is very relevant to this session, and it might just be a little bit familiar to some of you. Let's talk a little about my business, how it fell apart, and how it finally came back together. I left my career as a therapist at the end of 2011 to do web work full-time. I had just started working with Genesis exclusively, and I couldn't believe how many new clients I was getting once my portfolio was updated with Genesis sites. So everything was great. My only problem was I had a lot of anxiety about the design phase of my projects because, let's just be honest here, I am a terrible designer. As the internet moved away from the awful text-based 1990s designs that we make fun of now toward the feature-heavy sites that we build today, my skills just weren't enough. I felt like a total imposter. This became really obvious about 2 years ago when I presented a mock-up to a client. Even though I had created exactly what he asked for, he hated it. He was so disappointed, and he let me know about it. So I scrambled and came up with something else, and it turned out okay in the end. But after that experience, I was absolutely paralyzed. For every project after that, I procrastinated during the design phase. I would get the client to sign off on the wireframes and the overall idea of the site, but I could not bring myself to actually do the design. I would literally get sick before I was supposed to send a link or mock-ups to a client. I let this go on until I'd missed a couple of deadlines, refunded some deposits. I really didn't know how I could continue freelancing, and I thought I was going to have to go back to a real job. And if you know me, you know that a real job is not something that I want to do. So, after a few months of this chaos, I just decided I have to get it together here. I took a hard look at what I was doing, what I enjoyed and didn't enjoy, and what I was going to have to do to keep my business from falling apart. And that's when I realized I just need to quit designing. I am not a designer. Not that I can't, but I'm not good at it. So I decided to rebrand myself as a developer who just works with designers to code their mockups into Genesis themes. A little over a year later, which is now, I know I made the right choice, and for the first time in a long time, I love what I do again. So that's a little bit of my story, and that's why I'm on my soapbox tonight about the importance of at least considering working with a developer. The first question we need to answer is, why would you outsource at all? Sure, I just told you sort of a quick version of my story, but you're probably wondering what that has to do with you and your business. So let's talk about that. When you think about your business, ask yourself, how many hats are you really wearing? If you're like me, probably a lot of them, and I'm not just talking about my Viking helmet. You probably aren't even factoring all of these extra roles into the rates that you charge your clients. I know from experience how overwhelming it can be to feel like a one-person circus act, especially if there are some parts of the job that just don't appeal to you. The great thing about freelance work is that there are tons of specialties. If there's something that you don't want to do, I guarantee someone is out there just dying to do that very thing. Clients are far more likely to understand, hey, we're going to bring in a copywriter to take care of the content on your site, and this is what he or she charges, versus you sending them this slide and saying, hey, look at all these things I did, you need to pay me more. Okay, tell me if this looks familiar to you. You start a new project and everything is great. You work with the client to get an idea of the scope of the project and his or her goals. Then you start on the design. That is, if you're not paralyzed and freaking out like I used to be. Depending on how you structure the revision process, things might get a little stressful when the client starts asking for changes, but it's nothing you can't handle. Once the revisions are done, you start coding. For a lot of you, this might be where things start to go downhill. It's fine for a while, but then you realize that there's something you don't know how to do. So you Google. You visit the Genesis Facebook group and write a post asking for help. You might go to the Slack group and ask people for tips, but you're just not getting the detailed answers that you need to get this project done. From there, you might drown your sorrows in a drink, or 5 or 10, or a bag of Snickers bars. You can pick your poison. You start thinking, I have made a horrible mistake. The show must go on though, so you have a good cry, and you wake up the next day to Google some more. You might get to a point where you swear that you're never building another website, or you just might swear. You start thinking desperate thoughts. Eventually, you figure out the problem. You launch the site 5 minutes before the deadline, or if you're me, maybe 2 weeks after the deadline. Then you collapse in your bed and you realize the project took 70 hours and you ended up making about 12 cents for each of those hours. You start to fantasize about a world where you can actually get paid adequately for the work that you do. Seriously, does this sound familiar to you? If you're honest with yourself, a lot of you are probably nodding right now and going, yes, I know what this is about. If so, you may be a prime candidate for outsourcing development. Let's look at a saner, easier, better way to structure your client projects. Imagine if your workflow looked like this. This is what it looks like to outsource development. You're still working with the client to set goals and do the design, but then you hand off that design to be coded by somebody else. In the meantime, you can move on to your next project, or you can take a break, take a vacation, whatever you want to do. When development is done and the site's been launched, you collect your final payment, and you probably still have most of your hair left. Alright, now that you've seen how much easier your workflow can become, you may be thinking this whole outsource thing might not be too bad. The next question is, how do you find a developer to work with? Here are some considerations to make your search a little easier. Here we have some totally fictional developers, each with his or her own strengths and weaknesses. First, we have Rhonda. She's a great PHP developer, but she hasn't really worked with Genesis before. Her rates are good though, and she doesn't take on a lot of projects, so you could get on her schedule pretty quickly. Next up is Leonard. Leonard works with Genesis all the time, but his rates are way higher than you expected. He's also booked far into the future. Third is Samuel. He knows Genesis and he can customize existing child themes, but he doesn't know PHP and he usually uses a page builder for complex layouts. Lee is next on the list. She doesn't work with Genesis at all. She's a good developer, but she only builds custom themes from scratch. The good thing about Lee is she can build these custom themes in just a few days. Finally, we have Donald. Donald is a Genesis wizard, but he's not so great with CSS. His projects function well, but they don't always look like the mockup. Now, you may be looking at these 5 people thinking there's supposed to be a clear winner, but that's really not the case. The fact is, each of these developers could be the right one for the job depending on what the job calls for. As the designer, you need a clear idea of exactly what skill set is required to get the project done and make your client happy. If you have a project that requires a very complicated API integration, for example, Rhonda might be a great fit. If, though, it's more important that you work within the hooks and filters in Genesis, Leonard or Donald may be a better choice. If you have a client with a low budget who just wants some changes to an existing StudioPress theme, Samuel's probably your guy. Leonard may come in handy if you need an uncommon feature that relies heavily on Genesis Core. He's probably booked up for a good reason. This is a long way of saying that you can't just wake up one day and find a business partner that afternoon. Only you know what types of projects you usually work on, so you're in the best position to communicate your requirements to anybody that you're considering, and if they have any integrity, they'll let you know if they're not the best fit. One way to vet developers is to ask for a zip of a Genesis theme that he or she built. You can tell a lot about someone by the way they code. Not that a work in progress should be an indicator, because we all tend to make a mess and then go back and clean it up toward the end. But by looking at a finished theme, you can check to see whether the style sheet and PHP files are organized or a jumbled mess. I may be biased, but I believe sloppy code indicates poor quality. If a developer can't take time to leave well-ordered, documented code for whoever is going to come along behind him or her, I would hesitate to work with that person. If you see crazy, mangled CSS that all runs together, or anything else that makes you raise an eyebrow, I vote that you move on. It's not worth it risking your reputation with the client to partner with that particular developer. On a lighter note, we've all seen some form of this graphic before, but it's worth repeating. When it comes to most anything, you can only pick two of these: good, cheap, or fast. If the work is good and it's cheap, it's going to take a long time. If it's cheap and fast, it's probably not very good. And if it's good and fast, it's not going to come cheap. None of us want clients who bargain shop or look for the cheapest possible solution. Keep that in mind when you're looking for a developer. We enjoy food and electricity just as much as you do, and we've worked just as hard to develop our skills. As long as you keep that in mind and take time to find the right person for the job, you'll have a great experience working with a dev. Anytime another person comes on board during one of your projects, things can get complicated pretty quickly. Here are some tips for planning so that everyone walks away satisfied. This is one of the most important things I'll tell you in this entire session. Do not wait until your design is finished to bring in a developer. He or she should be involved from the very beginning to make sure things go as smoothly as possible. During the planning stages of your project, it's a good idea to let your dev know what kind of project you're discussing with the client, what kind of timeline you're looking at, and what sort of structure the finished theme or website is going to have. It's okay if these are tentative plans. At least the dev will feel somewhat prepared for the work ahead. This is especially important for pricing, which we'll talk about shortly. While you're working on your mock-ups, it's great to do a screen share or send over drafts or just have some sort of communication 1 or 2 times each week. This gives the developer a heads up on the number of templates required, what types of functionality are going to be included, and what expectations both you and the client have for the finished product. This prevents a situation where you hand off your mock-up and your developer goes, yeah, I can't do that. Or, I didn't schedule nearly enough time for the project, so we need to push back the launch. Those are not things that you or your client want to hear, so it's important to be sure that those things don't happen. Similarly, your developer should stay in touch with you throughout the development phase of the project. There may be a quiet period initially as he or she starts to code, but when things from the design are being implemented and functionality is starting to come in, you need to see what's going on. You should always schedule some time to review the finished theme before the client is scheduled to preview it, just to make sure it looks and works the way you expect. One thing that can kill a partnership quickly is assumptions or unmet expectations. This is where communication is absolutely essential. Before you ever shake hands with your dev or sign any kind of contract, you need to discuss how everything will work. One big question is, who's going to talk to the client? In my own development work, sometimes I take over the entire project once I get the mock-ups and the designer isn't involved anymore at all. Other times I only hear from the client during launch, Or I may not even do that if the project is white labeled and the client doesn't know that there's a developer involved. Sometimes the clients will contact me if there's something wrong after launch, and other times they may contact the designer instead. These are the types of things that you need to discuss before projects happen. In my experience, the teeny tiny details that no one thinks are important are almost always what kills a partnership. There is nothing like running into a problem during a project launch and finding out that neither one of you made a backup because you each thought the other person did it. Or, even more fun, you realize that the client doesn't have a license for a premium plugin that was a big part of the design, yet you don't have a license key for it and neither does your partner. There is really no such thing as too much discussion. Once you've worked with someone for a while, the two of you will get more comfortable with each other, and these conversations may not be necessary, but until that happens, definitely set aside some time to chat about the little things. When it comes to partnering with designers, there are 4 main things a developer needs to know up front. First, we need to know what is most important in your design. If there's a conflict between 2 plugins that are needed for the site, which one goes and which one stays? Or if a template you ask for is more complex than expected, can I make some changes, or does it have to look and work exactly like the mockup? Once we know what you want, we're better able to meet your expectations. Similarly, we need to know the goals of the design. When I view a finished mockup, I'm looking over each page or each template to see what purpose it serves and what action the visitor is supposed to take on that page. Don't give me something to code just because it looks cool. Help me understand how it relates to everything else and how it's going to help this client with his or her goals. If you're working with a client on a redesign, we also want to know how bad the current site is. That sounds bad, but it's just the truth. When you take over where anyone else left off, there is always something weird. We would rather know about those challenges ahead of time and not find out during the launch of the new theme when everything's broken. A good solution for this is to get a full backup of the client's existing site or let the developer do it so that Genesis can be installed there and the developer can kind of keep track of what things need to be removed or added or changed. Finally, we want to know how picky the client is. Not in a mean way, but we care just as much about the client's happiness as you do, and we want to make sure we get things right. Some clients are laid back and they understand if something needs to be altered or maybe the launch date moves ahead by a day or 2. Other clients may have a complete nervous breakdown. Either one of those is okay, but knowing that up front helps us take actions that keep the client at ease. Alright, now that you know how to plan your projects, let's talk about the most important part of this, pricing. It's common for designers to worry that they'll make less money if another person is involved. In some situations, that could technically be the case, but keep in mind that you should be able to complete designs faster when you aren't coding them by yourself. So while you may earn a little less per project, you should be making more money overall. Also, you'd be surprised how much easier it is to raise your rates when your clients see that there are 2 distinct processes involved in building their websites. This isn't a convenience store where the client can go in, grab some dish detergent and a burrito for $3, which is what happens sometimes when you say, hey, I'll wear all the hats, I'll do all these things for this one price. I like to compare a web project to plastic surgery. You can have liposuction and it costs a certain amount of money. But if you also need to remove the loose skin that's left over from the liposuction, that's a separate procedure and it has its own cost. Let's take a look at a couple of pricing strategies you can use when working with a developer. I have a clear favorite here, but it's important to know all the options in case something else might work better for you. One approach to pricing is splitting everything 50-50. This is what most people think about when they imagine outsourcing development. However, I'm not convinced that an even split is fair to anyone. As the designer, you may feel you deserve more, and rightfully so, because you're doing all the project management, you might be working with the client doing training, All of those sorts of things take time and take effort and involvement on your part. However, a developer may sit in his or her head and say, well, the designer didn't charge enough in the first place because look at how much work was required on my side. In most cases, I don't believe people walk away happy when they use this approach. Another approach I've seen is a percentage-based but not an equal split. The two partners might look at their roles in the project and somehow arrive at a percentage that each of them did, and that determines how much each person gets paid. The problem with that is, what if the percentages aren't so clear-cut? For example, a designer will most likely handle most of the onboarding process with the client. However, the developer may handle things like a theme walkthrough video that could kind of fit into that category. If you're involving your developer in the planning process, like we talked about earlier, it's likely you both spent a pretty equal amount of time on planning, so you can't really consider that. And now look at the launch phase, which is almost always something the developer does. So when you look at those factors, how can either person say who did the most work? How do you split it up? You end up back at 50-50, which doesn't work very well. Now we're speaking my language. I prefer a distributed approach where the designer and developer each quote separately. Each person decides what his or her work on the project is worth based on the scope, and each person is paid that amount. It doesn't matter what the other person is being paid because you chose the amount you thought was fair for the work you did. You may be asking yourself, how would a distributed approach work when you do your proposals? There are two main ways you can do that, both of which I've used before with no big issues. The first option is creating a single proposal with separate line items for design and development. As I mentioned before, simply letting the client know that there are two parts to this can go a long way in getting an acceptance of your proposal. This is normally what I do when I work with designers, and it usually works really well. A second option is to provide a proposal for the design only, then send the client to your developer for a separate quote. There's a little bit of risk here that the client is going to think development is $500, and then they'll run away screaming and take your mock-up to some PSD to WordPress in 2 hours type of company. So it's important, if you're going to go separate, to give them at least a ballpark. You can say things like, in the past when I've done projects like these, this is the range that the development was in. However, separating design and development can also work really well when clients have a low budget, because each professional can provide options to take things away or to spread out into phases, and it doesn't affect the other person getting paid for their work. So that's something to consider as well. No matter how you choose to price your projects, working with a developer does not mean you have to go broke. It doesn't mean you have to work your fingers to the bone. If you talk to developers and you find that you're not charging anything close to what they are, it may be time to raise your rates. For example, if your average project is $750 and all the devs you contact are charging $4,000 to develop, suddenly sending these $5,000 quotes to your clients might cause a little sticker shock, especially if you've worked with them before and they're used to something under $1,000. This is a slight tangent, but if you find that you're booked out more than 6 to 8 weeks in the future, that's a sign that it's time to raise your rates. Try 25%, and I bet nobody even notices. It is perfectly okay to take on fewer projects if you're earning the same amount of money or more. Now for the part you've all been waiting for, or maybe that was just me. Let's talk about some specific things you can do when you create mock-ups that will make your developer love you forever. This is a for real list of all the things I would do to mock-ups if I had a magic wand. Some designers are better about certain things than others, but I have to believe sometimes people have just never been aware that they can make things easier for the person who's going to code this theme. The first thing on my wish list is proportion. When you create mock-ups, Keep in mind how Genesis is normally structured and structure your mockups the same way. That doesn't mean your mockup has to look just like Genesis sample, but if you know that your developer uses the standard 1200 pixel grid, providing a mockup that is some random size like 1164.5 pixels wide just doesn't make any sense. If you're mocking up an existing Genesis theme to be customized, make sure that the structural parts fit into the same sizing unless there's a real reason why they shouldn't. Second on my wish list is consistency. You know how sometimes you put lorem ipsum on your mockups and the spacing is kind of weird? It's pretty common for designers to grab that text box and just stretch it a little bit and make it look better. The problem is I can't use 17.79643 point font on the real website, so the finished product is not going to look the same. Some clients will be very, very distressed if this happens. I speak from experience. Likewise, don't include silly things like a different logo on every page or footer widgets that are only on arbitrary sections of the site. Not only are those elements a nightmare to implement, but they also make things very confusing for visitors. My third wish list item for mockups is intent. If you put something on your mockup that allows visitors to take an action, something like an opt-in form, a contact form, a link, a button, and even sometimes an image, if anything is supposed to happen when a mouse hovers or clicks on that element, I need to know what that is. Don't expect me to know that you want 0.7 opacity on buttons or that you want the links to turn purple and underline on hover. My brain may be on a completely different planet from yours when it comes to those things, and that can cause a lot of revisions that wouldn't have been necessary if the mockup had told me what the intent was. Fourth on my list is completeness. If I receive a mock-up of the homepage only, I'm probably going to give you back a theme that only has a homepage because I don't want to make assumptions about how this is going to work. Now, if the site's pages are just regular old Genesis pages, there's absolutely nothing special, just mention that. You might even put in a section or a note in your mock-up that lets me know these are the elements that aren't changing. But if certain pages need a widget area that doesn't show on other pages, or if single blog posts have an opt-in at the bottom or a certain graphic element by the titles, I need to see that to be able to build it. Finally, when I view your mockups, I am always wishing for more information on how the client is going to use this theme. If I look at a homepage layout, I'm not sure whether you want me to do a modified Genesis loop, whether you want custom fields or widgets so that the client can change things. Just letting me know how the layouts will be managed by the client going forward goes a long way. Now, several designers that I've worked with have told me they worry that I'm critiquing their Illustrator or Photoshop skills and it makes them nervous. They don't want to send me a mock-up. But I can promise you that's not what any developer is worried about at all. Let's take a look at a couple of real mock-ups so that I can give you a better idea of what I'm thinking as I view your designs. I've got 3 mock-ups here that we're going to look at. This first one is actually a Themeforest template. It's not a Themeforest theme, but it was an Adobe Illustrator template available for download. And it has multiple pages, which is really helpful in pointing out what works and what doesn't. So in looking at this mock-up, the first thing I notice is the carousel at the top. I know it's going to be a carousel because they've given me some arrow indicators, which is great. So I can look at this and I know exactly what's going to happen there. What I don't know is what's going to happen to this carousel on mobile, because as you can see, it's showing 3 of the carousel images at once. You've got one that's in front and 2 that are behind it, and I'm not sure how that's going to work for mobile. I assume that we'll show one at a time, but they didn't let me know that. So The next thing I noticed is here we have a back to top little button, and it's showing on my big screen toward the bottom, but I don't know when I look at this whether it's going to stay there no matter where I scroll, if it's scrolling with me as I go down the page. So that's something that I would need to find out from the designer. Scrolling down a little bit, this area looks a little small to me. So I click on it and I see that it's 980 pixels. The problem is, I don't think there is a Genesis theme that's 980 pixels. Now, some of the older ones were 960, but everything that is HTML5, which is what I would be building on, is 1200. And it's not that I can't change those dimensions and make it this size, but it seems like it would be strange and a lot of extra work and very small on the screen, since most people are using something widescreen or a very large monitor. Also in this section, we've got 3 paragraphs and a read more link under each one that have identical text. So looking at that, I know already that when we have actual content in those spots, they're not going to break on exactly the same lines and have the read mores neatly lined up. And that can be very stressful for a client when they've seen this on a mock-up and they expect those to line up perfectly, and then maybe one of the excerpts has got slightly longer text or longer words that push things onto different lines, and then they say, well, wait, this doesn't look like I thought it would. So that could be a problem. Something else I don't know looking at this is where all this content comes from. These could be custom fields, they could be widgets. We could have kind of half widgets, half an actual page. So right now I'm a little confused about how this is going to work for the client. One thing that I like as I scroll down toward the bottom is that the images have dimensions on them. This is very helpful for me. I mean, yes, I can go over here and click on an image and I can see what size it is, but it's just good to know that there's a set size and I need to include that in the theme. In this latest from the blog section, I see we've got identical post titles, identical post info, and an identical excerpt. And my questions immediately are, what happens if the title goes on to a second line or maybe even a third line? Or what happens if a post is in 5 categories instead of 2 and the post info goes on to another line? You know, it may not line up exactly with those images at 140 by 100. So that could be something that stresses the client or the designer out, and that's something that I would need to know before I can move forward. The Our Client section, I know that's a carousel. We've got the little indicators for previous and next, and I know exactly what size the logo should be, so that works out great. And then here at the bottom, we have footer widgets, which is easy, and a menu. Now, I don't know what happens to any of those things on hover, but at least I know that they're there. And unless I'm told otherwise, I assume that is site-wide. So that's helpful to me. Now, if we move on to this templates blog page, first off, we've got a little hand that is showing us that we're hovering. So I know what color the post titles are on hover, and that's great. But again, if we scroll down a little bit, we've got an identical post right here. Same title, same post info. So again, I'm not sure what's going to happen when a title or the post info is longer or shorter. One other concern, we've got these large featured images that are 700 by 300. And I'm sure they'll look great, but a lot of times clients have not uploaded images that are large enough to fill that space. And even when I resize the thumbnails, if it's not wide enough or tall enough to begin with, you're going to get either something kind of distorted or not quite the right size, and then it can make the layout look off. So that's just something to think about. And in some cases, clients have had to go back and replace their featured images depending on what they had before. Looking at this recent post in the sidebar, I'm glad to have the hover state for those links and the image sizes, but I don't know if that's the regular WordPress recent posts widget, or if it's Genesis featured posts, or if it's some other plugin. So having more information about that would be great. On the second post, we randomly have a slider in place of a featured image, and that's okay, that can be done, but it seems kind of random. And my question for the designer would be, how do we know whether a post is going to have a featured image or a slider? Do we need to put in custom fields so that they can, check a box and say, hey, this one has a slider? How is that going to work? And is that something where I would use a slider plugin, or do you want me to code that in? And another issue is we already have a logo carousel on the home page, and then we have the top carousel on the home page. So this is a third type of slider, and depending on the plugin, if we're using a plugin, we may need more than one, and that's a lot of scripts loading, and I just don't know that it makes sense to have a slider on the blog page, but maybe that's just me. Scrolling down a little bit, we have this Flickr feed widget, and again we have the image sizes, which is great, but I don't know if that is something that is being done manually, or if that's something I need to code by hand, or if it's a plugin. I would assume it's a plugin, but I don't want to assume things, so I would need to ask the designer about that. And down here at the bottom, we've got the little hover hand, but it's hovering on the next button that doesn't look any different from the other buttons. So I'm not sure from that if I'm being told that it doesn't do anything on hover, or if there might be a slight gradient change, maybe. And then we do see that the current page is highlighted in blue, so that's helpful. Moving on, we have a frequently asked questions page. And as far as the search functionality, I would really want to know what the designer had in mind here, as it looks like we've got some categories for frequently asked questions and then accordions. And I'm not sure what kind of search off the top of my head would allow someone to search those. I also don't see the search results, so I don't know how those should look. A positive thing here is we have the hover state for the categories. We have the active state. If we scroll down, we can see an open accordion to see how that looks, as well as the hover state. And we have a CTA here that was not on the homepage or blog page, so I would want to know exactly where that needs to show up. My favorite thing about this template is this page. Let me scroll back up. This page gives me all kinds of elements that are included in the theme, as well as hover states that I haven't seen. So now I know what a submenu looks like, a sub-menu, what the hover on each level of menu item looks like. I've got some message boxes, so I know how those need to look. And now I've got hover over here for our little back to top icon that I still don't know exactly how it behaves, but at least I know what happens when someone hovers on it. We have button styles. There are going to be testimonials, and they're going to be a slider. Again, that's 4. So we have 4 types of sliders and or carousels going on here. And then we have the latest tweets and Flickr, which I'm still not sure whether that's a plugin or not. So this is very helpful. It doesn't tell me everything that I need to know, but it does tell me quite a bit. And when I see a designer take the time to create something like this, it makes my world a total better place. Moving to the contact page, the first thing I see is this gigundo image. That's really large. Now, I would assume that that's going to be a Google map, because most contact pages that have an image show a Google map, but there's no direction here. So Without anyone telling me otherwise, I would probably assume that's an image that the client or a copywriter or someone else is going to add in. We also have hover states for some follow buttons, and I see that there's a tooltip that goes on each one on hover. I don't remember seeing these follow us icons elsewhere on the site, so if that is a separate sidebar or widgets that need to appear conditionally, that would be good to know. Going down to the contact form itself, the one thing that I don't know here is what happens on focus when you click into the input fields to enter your name or message. And I also don't know what the input text should look like. In most cases, it would be a little bit lighter than the input labels, but you never know. They may want something different. Last with this template, we're going to look at a services page. And we've got a couple of services here with an icon, a title and subtitle, and then a description. And all this is great, except I'm not sure where this is coming from. I don't know if this is a custom post type, or if this is a widgeted page, or maybe it's a template that pulls from somewhere else. It could even be custom fields. But I need to know, how does the client edit this? I'm really hoping the client is not supposed to go in after I've added a bunch of column classes and positioning and CSS classes, and try to make edits, because I think that would be very difficult. And if we scroll down, we've got a section at the bottom that says our process, and I'm assuming there should be some kind of hover effect on those 5 circles, but I'm not sure. I don't know if they lead anywhere or if that's just an image. I don't know if the text needs to be text or if it's part of the image. And then here at the bottom we have the Our Clients carousel again, but it hasn't been on any other page but the home page, so I would need to know exactly where that area is supposed to show up. Let's go on to another mock-up. This is not a real website, so no need to go look for it. And this one's just a simple one page. The first thing that I notice is up at the top we have social icons and a short menu, and I don't know the hover states. The same with the other navigation here. I'm not sure what's happening there. I'm not sure if there will be drop downs. Looking at this, I would almost make the assumption that I need to limit that menu to one level, but that may not be what the designer or the client wants. And we also need to think about what may happen down the road. If this is a newer site, they may only have 5 menu items at launch, but who knows what that could turn into later. Another concern that I have here is the logo, because I'm not sure if that's an image logo or if that is text where every word of the site title needs a span. So that's something I would need to check with the designer on. Over here in the opt-in we have a go. I don't know if that's a link, if it's a button. Don't know what goes on hover there. Now for this big image on the first post, when I click on that, it is 600 by 358 pixels. And that just seems odd and random to me. So my question for the designer here would be, was that supposed to be 600 by 350? Did you want 600 by 358 and I'm just reading too much into it? Or is this a situation where we want the featured image to be full width but variable height depending on the image itself? If I scroll down, we've got a grid that starts. So now immediately I'm going back up and I'm looking at this first post and thinking, now, is this a featured post widget? Is this the normal Genesis loop? Is this something else? Where is this the most recent post, or is this a featured post? Those are the kind of things that I need to know just to be sure that I build this in such a way that it works the way that the designer and the client expect. And as far as the grid of recent posts, same question. Is this a widget? Is this a modified Genesis loop? I need to know what level of control the client is going to have as well as how it needs to function. And in this section, as well as these lower categories, we have identical titles and identical dates. It looks very neat and very nice on the mock-up, but how often do you see a client who has a 3-word post title? Now, these are recipes on this mock-up, so I can picture a food blogger having, very long, complicated titles, chicken wraps with tofu filling, or, they're going to be longer. So the client may see this and think it looks great, and then when he or she sees the actual content filled in, it's not going to look quite as perfect. Here, there's also no footer and no footer widgets. I have never met a food blogger who did not want footer widgets for ads or Facebook like boxes or something. And there's also no footer, which is odd. I would assume that there's supposed to be a footer there, but I'm not sure. So that's a place where the designer, not having a footer is less common than having one. So if this really wasn't supposed to have a footer, I would expect a note down here that says, no, there's no footer. But pretty sure in this case, there needed to be one. Here in the sidebar, we have this very large placeholder that is 236 and some change by 686 and some change. That's not the size of any ad unit that I've ever seen. So I'm guessing that just showed there's more sidebar here. But I don't know that. Maybe there's supposed to be a bottom sidebar that has a gray background. This would have been a good place for the designer to let me know kind of what's going on. And then here we've got some posts. The title just says sidebar title. So I'm not sure if this is popular posts or favorite posts or, what goes here. And I don't know if it's the Genesis featured post widget or maybe WordPress popular posts. There are a lot of options here, and I just want to make sure that I'm making the right decision for the client. But I need to know where this is coming from and whether the client wants to be able to hand pick these or whether they're supposed to populate automatically. As far as this welcome widget at the very top, I assume that that's going to have a picture of the client. And sometimes I've done these with the Genesis, I think it's called the Genesis user widget. Other times I've had to hand code this in with column classes. So having a little direction from the designer on that as far as how that needs to work would be great. Excuse me. Let's move on to the last mock-up. This one's pretty busy, pretty complicated. And again, the first thing I noticed is up at the top, we have some social icons and an opt-in, and I don't have any hover states. So I'm not really sure what's supposed to happen there. My instinct, based on the sidebar opt-in, would probably be to go red on hover, and then maybe the opposite. Well, no, actually, now that I look at it, the sidebar can't be the opposite because the buttons would be the same color as the background. So that's a situation where the designer could have helped me out a lot by giving me the hover states. I also noticed that we've got logo here up in the top. Now, every other placeholder on the screen is a dark gray, and the logo has a blue that's not used anywhere else. So I would question whether the logo is supposed to have that blue background or whether it was just maybe a different color because it's the logo. Moving down, we have several areas, and just in these two on the right and left, we have 3 different featured image sizes going on. And that's okay, that's doable. But from a visitor perspective, I think it's a little confusing, especially with these thumbnails. Here on the right, we've got 50 by 50, and then on the left, we have 75 by 75. And I don't know that that's the best decision visually or not. And often that's not my job to determine, but in this case, I think it could kind of be confusing for people. In the sidebar, we have got 728 by 90 ad space that is clearly not 728 by 90. I am no mathematician, but I'm pretty sure that's 300 by 250. Yes. So that's probably just a case where we had the 728 by 90 up in the header. So the designer probably copied and pasted the text. But given the chaos that can go on sometimes during a project, I may not realize that, and I may make a space there that's, or stick a 728 by 90 in there, and then it looks weird. The only other widget that the sidebar has in it is one with a headline and a white background. I'm not sure if this is how every other widget that's not an opt-in or an ad should look, or if that's a specific widget for something. So that would be good to know. And here, as we scroll down, we've got a red button here with no hover. And then this widget here in the middle of the screen, this one I'm not really sure what's going on. I don't know if this is a custom menu, if this is just a list, if it's a blog roll. We just have some companies and we're not really sure what they do. So I'd like some direction there. And then one thing that pops up only because it was an issue on the actual project is if you look at this right column compared to the left one, there's just a teensy difference at the bottom in their heights. And when I saw this originally, I assumed that because each side has got different content, different image sizes, etc., that we would know that those were variable height and that they may not be identical. Well, the client was very upset by that. He expected them to take up the exact same amount of room, and doing that in a compliant way as much as possible meant that we had to put in Flexbox CSS, and it was not great. It was not a good time for anyone. He was also upset with the menu items both at the top and bottom. Seeing them here, they're all the same length because they all say the same thing except for different numbers. But on the actual site, once we put in his pages and his categories, the text was obviously longer or shorter depending on whatever the title was. And he wanted all of that text to be a uniform width regardless of how long or short. So, for example, we had a home menu item, and when you look at something like home next to a category that was, I don't know, something like investing strategy, the text was so stretched out that it just looked ridiculous. And of course, once he saw that, he said, okay, let's scratch this and go back. But it was the time that it took to get it done, and the fact that, we ended up not even using that after all that work. Another big question that I would have had from this had I not talked to the designer ahead of time is where all these homepage sections come from. Now, I know after completing the project that they are widget areas, and every single one of these is a Genesis featured post widget, but if I was looking at this for the first time, I may not know, and that's something important as far as whether we're doing custom fields or a custom loop or something else. So these are just a few examples of some mock-ups and the questions that would go through my mind in reviewing the pages. Hopefully this is helpful to you in thinking about how to structure things for someone else to come in and actually code what you created. When you do it yourself, obviously you know what you want, and you may not always include all of these pieces, but it's essential to do that when someone else is going to pick up where you left off and try to turn this into something functional for the client. The launch phase is the most exciting part of the project. Design and development are finished, the client has signed off, and hopefully you got final payment before moving any files to the client's hosting. In many cases, your developer will launch and set up the new theme, but it's important to go over the details in advance to make sure everyone understands their responsibilities. If you're working with a developer, you already know there will be 3 people involved in the launch process: you, the developer, and the client. Oh, but wait, who's that coming out of nowhere? Oh my gosh, it is A random mystery guest. This could be anyone from an ad manager to a site co-owner to the client's Aunt Shirley, but I found there is almost always an extra person involved or two when it's time for launch. To minimize stress, ask your client ahead of time whether anyone else is going to be part of the launch process. Make sure the client understands that this is the time to get the new site or the new theme loaded up, and other people can always check it afterward to make sure things are okay. For example, if there's an ad manager involved, they can go through the theme after it's live, and if there are any issues with the ads, they can be fixed. In the event that you do have to work with an unknown person during launch, just make sure you have decided whether you or the developer will be responsible for managing and making any adjustments that are needed. I probably sound like a broken record by now, but it is so important to discuss the launch process with your developer way before launch day ever arrives. If both of you know who's doing what, you'll avoid stepping on each other's toes. Make a list of what tasks have to be completed, including who's going to actually complete each one and when it's going to happen in the process. I've been in situations where I was editing a style sheet at the same time as the designer. Both of us had noticed just a little minor issue that we needed to fix, and it was not pretty. Both of us thought we were losing our minds because we kept saving changes and then they would be erased because we were saving on top of each other. In general, it's a good idea to make sure only one person is logged into the site at a time during launch and that you're communicating pretty much constantly. I like to use either phone or chat, sometimes Skype, to sit with the designer during launch and make sure that we both know what's happening. In 19 years of building websites, I don't think I've ever had what I would call a perfect launch. There's always going to be a hiccup, and having an extra person involved, or a random mystery guest and an extra person, can make those issues far more stressful than they have to be. As long as roles are clearly defined ahead of time, you and your developer can survive project launches without strangling or maiming each other, and hopefully you have both, finished the project with a sense of togetherness and friendship and not being angry. That's always the goal. Very quickly, since we're almost out of time, let's review what we've gone over in this session. First, we discussed why you should outsource development. It's time to stop working so hard and work smart instead. Next, I talk about some qualities to look for in a developer and the fact that different people can be great assets depending on the project, even if they have different skills. We then reviewed the project planning process and how you can involve a developer to keep everyone in the loop. Pricing is always a huge concern, but we talked about a couple of pricing models you can use when outsourcing development. We went over some mock-ups and I nitpicked them just a little bit to give you an idea of what you can improve if you're making mock-ups to pass off to a dev. Finally, we went over a few quick tips for launch to help everyone stay sane. I will leave you with this very apt quote from Helen Keller, which is one of my favorites. This applies to all aspects of human existence, but especially to building relationships with other professionals to grow your business. If you'd like to chat, feel free to reach out to me on social media. Twitter is my absolute favorite, and that's where I'm at the most. Or you can reach out in the Genesis Slack group. You can also find me at nutsandboltsmedia.com or dailybolt.com. Thank you sincerely for your time. I hope you gained lots of new information in this session and that you'll let me know if you have any feedback or questions. I hope that outsourcing development is something that doesn't sound like a nightmare to you now if it did before, or that it's something you might consider in the future. Peace out, Genesis Camp.